Welcome to Brainstorm MTG. I'm ELD, and this is Fast Effect Double Speed Magic the Gathering. This is the top four, the final match that was played out at the ELD Vintage Open 2. We've got two of the best decks in the format here, slight variations on Paradoxical Outcome, and Micah starting out with a Mox Sapphire into Preordain, and does not find a land, has to pass. There's an island for Craig, says that's what you were looking for, along with a Lotus, an Opal, and a Mana Vault. 7 mana available. Oh, by the way, Ancestral. All right. This is getting pretty one-sided here. Craig with a massive advantage of both mana and cards. There's an island for Micah, along with Soul Ring, into Time Vault. So all he needs now is Voltaic Key, and he'll be looking at infinite turns. Craig, during the upkeep, a very dangerous card, Vampiric Tutor. We'll see what he's grabbing there. Not going to be good for Micah. And he taps 3 for Time Vault and Voltaic Key. That is going to do it. Micah scooping it up. Craig assembling infinite turns there. Wasn't quite infinite because he had the Mana Vault tapped, but he could have untapped it, so all he needs to do is draw one more mana source over the next 17 turns, and he would have been fine. So pretty darn likely there. Might not have been the worst thing in the world to make him play it out a little bit. I guess it was within the realm of possibilities for him not to draw any mana. Maybe he would have had to pass the turn with a grip full of counter spells. But that would have been pretty bad for Craig. Almost impossible. You'd have to, even if you let Micah stack his deck from there, he'd still definitely not be favored in the matchup. But going into game 2, so far we've seen a lot of Mother Gorilla defending Baby Gorilla brutality. I mean, we're talking a lot of 2-0 sweeps that have been quite brutal, and we'll see if Craig can continue that trend despite these decks being quite similar. Vintage is a very powerful format. Very often there'll be a single decision that determines who wins or loses a match. Very different than other formats in that regard. The way I like to try and explain to some people who've never played Vintage is very often in a match, it'll go to 3 games. Y'all have a game where you're just super favored. They'll have a game where they're super favored. And you'll have one game where it could go either way. And there's just a key decision that ends up being win or lose. And sometimes that's just as simple as, which land do you fetch? How do you sequence your spells? Which spells do you fight over? Is that a card that's worth Force of Willing? The individual power level of the cards in Vintage is such that you're not just going to be countering your opponent's cards that win the game. This is not, playing against Sneak and Show and they play their show and tell, and you're like, oh, I guess I have to counter that. I mean, what do you do? Like, this is a perfect example here. So Lotus into Merchant Scroll into Ancestral. We've got a bunch of different tipping points there. Do you Force a Will that Lotus on the first turn? Do you Force a Will the Ancestral? Those are very real choices. And here, we'll see if Craig makes any move on this Ancestral. He certainly doesn't have Misstep. And I imagine Craig would Force a Will the Ancestral. I think in this matchup, it would be correct to do so. So I'm going to go ahead and assume that Craig does not have any counter magic that's accessible for 0 mana. He drops a Scalding Tarn and a Mox Pearl. That Polluted Delta gets cracked for Micah. He grabs an Underground Sea. That's going to turn on all of his tutor effects as well as, of course, producing blue mana, which is what the deck is hungriest for. A Misty Rainforest coming down, and less explosive here than the previous game. Mystic Remora comes down, one of the best cards in the mirror. Shuts off almost the entire deck. Of course, in the main deck, there is a Monastery Mentor. There are some sideboard creatures that people potentially play as well. There's a Snapcaster sometimes, but for the most part, Mystic Remora says, do you want to play some cards? I'm going to get to draw some cards. And that is an exception. Kemble, I believe is how people are pronouncing it. He is a real mirror breaker. Every time your opponent plays a non-creature spell, it is a drain life for 2. They lose 2, you gain 2. And he is a 2/3 as well, so he can put a little bit of a clock out there, even if they do play around him. And that is just daggers. I mean, Micah has the sideboard card, or sorry, the strategical advantage with Mystic Remora. Says, hey, you want to do good stuff? I'm going to get to draw cards. And instead, he's got to let it go. And kind of more hurtful is the way you usually hide behind your Mystic Remora is obviously in Vintage there's not a ton of creatures, so you don't usually find this type of pressure, but you're also able to drop Moxes to continually pay that upkeep. And, you know, that's going to put some serious hurt on his life total. He's going to have to be very judicious with which spells he's playing. We got a Treasure Cruise here from Micah. I'm sorry, a Dig Through Time from Micah. If you do miss those cards, if you're a Legacy player, Vintage is the place where they landed. Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise, both often played in the same decks. They're restricted here, but they still do an awful lot of good work, and they can draw into much more powerful things than they do in Legacy. Micah, taking a look here, trying to figure out what his best options are out of these 7. But he's going to be taking 2 damage for every non-creature spell. Like a sauced up Eidolon of the Great Revels, and he has to let the Mystic Remora go. Plays a library. Taps to draw. And Preordain. That is a painful Preordain. Now, it's worth noting, if you had to choose in between letting your opponent draw cards or have this little 2-point drain life, I would rather take the drain life. Letting them draw cards is actually just game over. They're either going to draw counter spells and stop what you're doing, or they're going to end up drawing into their combo pieces and just wreck you. So, I mean, it could be worse. It could be Mystic Remora as well on the other side of the table. That would kind of be the absolute, perhaps unwinnable scenario. But, you know, it's Vintage. There's a lot of the time you're playing toward those small percentage outs, and that can be a lot of fun. I mean, those are the most fun that I have, trying to find a way to win when it's absolutely, you know, abysmal odds. Time Vault on the other side for Craig, tightening the noose for Micah. He's going to need to find an answer for both of those, or just win. I mean, that is actually the best answer in the format, is just winning. But it's a lot to ask from here. There's a Time Vault of his own, but only 6 life left. He's, in order to dig for a Voltaic Key. Oh, but he doesn't need to dig. He's got it at 4 life. And that's it. He can just untap it. He's got a Mox at the front of his hand. It looks like he might be thinking about playing it to keep like Flusterstorm up. Just untap it. It doesn't really... I mean, if you play the Mox, then you can't even Flusterstorm because you'll just die. So might as well just go for it. Just go for the untap and see if Craig's got it. If he's got it, he's got it. See here. And he plays the Mox. Okay. He untaps. Snapcaster Mage just because. Okay. Well, this should do it. Let's see if he can win from 2 life. It would have been a lot easier if he could have cast Tinker or something. Let's see what he can draw into. He's got infinite turns. If it is possible for his deck to win, he will win from here. He's leaving that Ruby up there. And he's cycling through, Craig letting him essentially just go through this loop. Technically, he should be discarding. This is a little loose, but Craig just really wanting to see how he's going to win. And he plays his own Kemble. So what a ton of work he did in this matchup. That Snapcaster is a 2-1. Kemble is a 2-3, so that was not like a premature scoop there. It was actually just going to be able to turn sideways and actually just attack repeatedly. 15 more turns, as long as he had 17 cards left in his deck, that would have been sufficient. And if he does run Blightsteel, he could actually just go to discard Blightsteel, and just take, and essentially just do infinite damage there. Every single one of your turns would be draw, discard Blightsteel, draw, attack for 2, discard Blightsteel, and that would just be a permanent loop, which would be able to beat somebody from any life total. So there we go. Micah finding a way, going to game 3. Glad to see we've got a real match here. A little bit of drama. 3 games, that's the way it should be here in the top 4. And now Craig going to be on the play. In these matchups, being on the play can be absolutely crucial if you're able to resolve your PO before your opponent. Often that 3 or 4 cards extra that you draw off it, definitely a game breaker. Of course, they can chain together quite well on the first turn. However, very often it's just a boost of card advantage in all but the best of scenarios. We've got a torn sleeve here for Micah. Swap that out. Craig assessed his hand and is marching back down from that lofty 31 life points he had back to 20. Library go from Craig, hoping for a slower game. Library on the play. Library from Micah. Now he gets to tap to draw, being on the draw, and there's the Pearl. And Sensei's top, looking like a control matchup of old here. Dueling Libraries, basic island for Craig. Being on the draw, giving Micah a significant amount of card advantage here. He was able to activate Library on that first turn. Also has this Sensei's top. Dueling Libraries. What year is it? Often these PO decks would already be off to the races. There's a Preordain. One of the most important cards in the format now. Brainstorm and Ponder, both restricted. So Preordain acting as the only real 4-of option for cantrips. Sensei's top going to allow Micah to rearrange the top of his library. Draw will also create card advantage later. Talk about a mirror match here. Craig also finding Sensei's top. Decisions to be made here. Each one of them likely to be crucial. The power level so high. Like a drawing for turn and off of library. See what he does with his limited mana. Ideally, he'd be drawing a bit more mana. Particularly acceleration like Mox's. Makes his land drop and an emerald, keeping it 7 cards. Preordain for Craig. And a Mox Ruby. Passing. See a lot of spinning Sensei's top here, trying to find a way out of what is likely a fistful of counters on the other side. Must counters or cards that wreak havoc on the whole strategy. I think Mystic Remora, one of those cards to keep an eye out for. Of course, the more cards your opponent draws, the more likely it is they have mental misstep. very, very good to be able to get your opponent to try and force of will some cards here and start to gain a little bit of card advantage. Micah tapping to draw and drawing for turn. There's a probe, and it shows a bunch of counter magic, Gush, Tinker, 2 paradoxical outcomes, Flusterstorm, Snapcaster Mage. That is quite a mouthful. Snapcaster and Flusterstorm. And there's Mystic Remora, and that's exactly the type of thing that we're hoping for. Likely going to draw that Force of Will. Micah can potentially force back if he wants to, but that Flusterstorm looks like it would be problematic if he doesn't have blue to fluster the Fluster. Gonna probably spin the top. Does. Not really a ton he can draw here that's going to be helpful. Force of Willing back basically draws that Flusterstorm out of Craig's hand. But ideally, you want to start digging toward card advantage. Sensei's Top, so strong in this type of position too, because it can add another card to hand and get you back in library range. Of course, getting it back down is a lot harder in Vintage than it used to be in Legacy, given the prevalence of mental misstep. So the safest place for top is on the battlefield. Fetching. As these decks go on, getting more and more blue mana, the more dangerous they become. Really, the biggest bottleneck for the PO decks is the blue mana. The colorless mana tends to arrive in droves with all of the off-color moxes. And we see a Merchant Scroll. Let's see if Craig opts to hit this. It looks like he doesn't. It looks like Micah is being permitted to search through his library. And a very defensive play, Merchant Scroll grabbing Force. Two blue and a Gush from Craig. Gush also fantastic for getting back in library range, effectively adding +3 cards to hand. Seeing here, Time Vault with Demonic Tutor, Paradoxical Outcome, Force, Repeal, Treasure Cruise, a lot of super dangerous cards, but potentially only Force of Will gonna matter here. So Craig is in a very interesting situation. Ancestral here, he's building a storm count, making his Flusterstorm a real trump to this Force of Will. He's going to potentially be able to resolve whatever he wants. Still a blue floating. And that is going to draw Force pitching Repeal. He taps to draw in response. Does he use the floating blue for this Fluster? Drawn. Looks like he lets it go. So 3 mana, Tinker. He knows the coast is clear except for perhaps on top of the deck. He grabs Tinker for Blightsteel. And he's going to pass. So Micah, his hand had a lot of options as well. Craig taking a very direct line. Can you beat this card? I'm putting it on the table. It will kill you unless you kill me. One of us has to go. Treasure Cruise starting things out. And this is truly anybody's game from here. Force of Will from Craig, pitching Snapcaster. Spin top in response. Treasure Cruise is countered. Demonic Tutor. He had Time Vault in hand. Does not have a ton of mana here. See what it is. There's Lotus. Soul Ring. Time Vault. There's the Voltaic Key. Another force from Craig. Spins top. And there's the handshake. So Craig, with a tremendous amount of force of wills down the stretch there, shutting down Micah's very near comeback and goes on to split in the finals. Congratulations, Craig. That's all for this one. If you enjoyed the video, please help grow the channel by subscribing. You'll be notified when we upload new videos like Fast Effect, Double Speed Magic with commentary, or Untapped, our raw tournament gameplay. Thanks for watching.